Bizarre traditions that would shock modern eyes to fall asleep till sun rose like molten gold over Strasbourg, its heat pressing against the narrow cobbled streets with an almost tangible weight. In that sultry summer of 1518, the city exhaled a languid, sticky air, and yet beneath the ordinary rhythms of daily life, a strange, unbidden pulse began to awaken. At first, it was subtle, a tap of the foot, a sway of the hips, but then it grew, a force unrelenting, invisible, calling to the bodies of the townspeople as if the very stones of Strasbourg had absorbed some secret rhythm that no mortal ear could hear. One woman stepped into the street, her eyes wide, her limbs trembling, and she began to dance. At first, it was graceful, a solitary act, a private surrender to the strange compulsion that had taken hold. But soon others joined, drawn like moths to flame, unable to resist the silent summons that had seized them, the streets filled with motion, bodies pressing against bodies, arms flailing, skirts and cloaks swirling, as though the city itself had become a fevered stage for some unseen performance. The townspeople could not stop themselves. Feet blistered against the uneven cobbles, blood mingling with sweat, yet still they moved, turning and spinning, hopping and stomping, a ceaseless tide of flesh and sinew carried forward by a force no physician, priest, or magistrate could name. The cries of joy and agony intertwined in the summer air, echoing off half-timbered houses, bouncing into the alleys, carrying with them a scent of desperation and ecstasy. People collapsed mid-step, only to rise again, compelled by some invisible conductor whose baton no eye could see. Children were caught in the whirl, their laughter mingling with the groans of the infirm. Merchants abandoned stalls, spilling wares into the dust, their hands still twitching with the rhythm they could not control. By the week's end, the plague had claimed dozens, yet still it danced onward, relentless, as though the city itself had become a living heartbeat of madness. The authorities, bewildered and growing frantic, sought remedies of logic against an illogical force. Town councils decreed that dancing must be sanctioned, that more movement might offer a cure to movement itself. Guild halls and squares were opened, musicians were summoned to play for the afflicted, their flutes and viols compounding the spell. Priests invoked prayers and blessings, sprinkling holy water, exorcising demons from trembling limbs, yet nothing could halt the ceaseless turning, the unyielding sway that had infected Strasbourg. Hospitals overflowed with those who could move no longer, their bodies etched with exhaustion and wounds, and yet even the dead were left unattended in the streets, silent witnesses to a humanity caught in the grip of something beyond comprehension. Whispers of cause drifted through the heat-hazed streets. Some blamed divine wrath, punishment for sins the townsfolk could barely name. Others murmured of ergot, a fungus hidden in bread, twisting flesh and mind alike. Still others believed the plague was a manifestation of collective hysteria, a fever of the spirit as much as the body. And yet no record offers certainty. No chronicler could fully capture the madness that turned neighbor against neighbor, family against themselves, in a dance that blurred the boundary between joy and agony, life and death. Footsteps left trails of blood and dust, a mosaic of suffering and surrender that no hand could ever cleanse. Even in the quiet centuries that followed, the streets of Strasbourg, now tamed and silent, seemed to remember. The walls retained the memory of flailing arms and spinning skirts. The cobbles, polished by centuries, still held the ghostly echo of frantic feet. The plague whispers in hushed tones to those who listen, a reminder of the fragile line that separates desire from compulsion, mirth from madness, freedom from the invisible strings that may bind us. It is a lesson etched in blood and sweat, a myth of the body's betrayal of the mind, a haunting testament to the forces unseen that may rise within us all. Some say that the rhythm never truly ended, that it sleeps patient and quiet beneath the modern city, waiting for the summer heat to wake it again. And perhaps that is the most chilling truth of all, that what we celebrate as life, as dance, as joy, may conceal within it a pulse older than memory, a darker cadence that can seize even the saddest of hearts. It is a rhythm that belongs to no one, that answers to no command, and that moves through the world as invisibly as a shadow, as inexorably as time itself. In the end, Strasbourg's dancing plague is more than a story of fevered limbs and collapsed bodies. It is a parable of human fragility, a myth whispered through the corridors of history, a sacred reminder that beneath every celebration of life there may lie a darker music, pulsing quietly, waiting to sweep us up and carry us far beyond the bounds of reason, into a night where the body obeys forces the mind can neither name nor resist. And as we close our eyes in the darkness of our own rooms, imagining the streets of Strasbourg alive with spinning, desperate bodies, we feel a shiver of recognition, a trembling acknowledgement that the dance never truly ends, and that the line between joy and madness, between freedom and compulsion, may be thinner than we dare to believe. Beneath the cold, shadowed vaults of Rome, where stone walls bore the weight of centuries and candlelight trembled across cracked frescoes, a scene unfolded that no living mind could fully comprehend. It was the year 897, a time when power and piety were entangled like thorns around a fragile vine, and the city itself seemed to hold its breath in anticipation of something both sacred and grotesque. The air was heavy with incense, a sweet, cloying haze that mingled with the metallic tang of decay, and the murmurs of the clergy echoed faintly against the arches, each step a careful negotiation with fear and duty. And there, in the midst of the flickering shadows, a corpse was raised from the cold embrace of the grave. Formosus, once pope, now rotting, eyes sunken, jaw slack, was dragged from his tomb and clothed in papal vestments, a mockery of the power he had once wielded. The room recoiled at the sight, the living whispering prayers to guard their souls against the unnatural, while some shivered with morbid fascination. The dead pope was seated upon a throne, a grotesque silhouette against the flickering torches, and a deacon, trembling yet compelled, answered for him charges of perjury, of usurpation, of sins both mortal and spiritual, were read aloud, the syllables sounding hollow in the vast, echoing hall, each word struck like a bell tolling in a graveyard, reverberating through the hearts of the witnesses, binding them to the absurd, horrifying theater before them. The cadaver, a pale emblem of mortality, was no longer merely flesh, but a vessel of judgment, of vengeance, of human obsession with control beyond death. The spectators, nobles and commoners alike, leaned forward in fascination and fear, as though their very breath might animate the corpse or invite doom upon themselves. The sentence was delivered, as chilling in its finality as it was in its absurdity. The dead pope would be stripped of his sacred garments, his body cast into the Tiber, a river that swallowed history as easily as water swallowed flesh. And yet, even in this cruel punctuation of ritual, the body was retrieved, eventually returned to burial, leaving behind a shadowed question that would linger for centuries: who truly holds dominion, the living or the dead? As priests and officials departed, the stone carters seemed to pulse with the echo of that unnatural judgment. Candlelight flickered against the cold walls, casting shapes that suggested movement where there was none, whispering secrets of mortality and power. The ritual, grotesque and solemn, reminded the city that authority is fragile, that vengeance can extend beyond the grave, and that human fear and ambition can distort the natural order into something both terrible and mesmerizing. Even today, historians gaze upon the accounts and shudder, not merely at the act itself, but at the audacity of a society willing to suspend nature, morality, and reason to impose control over that which cannot answer. The Cadaver Synod is a haunting meditation on the thin veil separating life from death, justice from obsession, reverence from horror. It whispers through history that mortality alone does not protect the departed from the schemes of the living, and that obsession, once awakened, can bend the world into shapes both terrible and sacred. In the echo of the Tiberias waters, in the shadow of ancient stone, one feels the pulse of a city that dared to hold a dialogue with death itself, and the memory lingers like a faint heartbeat, reminding us that power, even when exercised over the lifeless, carries a weight that no living soul can ever wholly dismiss. The chambers of medieval Europe were thick with the scent of herbs and iron, a heavy perfume that clung to walls and skin alike. Candlelight flickered across polished wooden tables, illuminating jars of dried flowers, powders, and the glint of sharp instruments that promised both relief and peril. In the quiet of these dimly lit rooms, physicians moved with solemn purpose, their hands steady, their eyes fixed upon the fragile vessels of flesh laid before them. The year could be any year between the 12th and 17th centuries, for the practice endured across centuries, a ritual as much as a remedy. It was the art of bloodletting, a sacred dialogue between human suffering and the invisible humors that were believed to govern life itself. Noblemen and peasants alike were brought to the table, their garments rustling, their breasts shallow with fear and anticipation. A fevered child, a woman heavy with grief, a king desperate to maintain strength, that all became participants in a ritual that blended science, superstition, and a quiet terror that clung to the air. The physician's lance glinted in the Candlelight as if alive, a tool that might heal or hasten death. Leeches squirmed in bowls of water, waiting for the touch of skin, the warmth of blood, the slow communion that had been practiced for centuries. Every incision, every drop that fell, was both a prayer and a gamble, a negotiation with forces unseen, an act of devotion performed on the altar of the human body. Crowds whispered in corridors outside, listening to the faint sounds of pain and relief, imagining the balance of life hanging upon a thin thread of crimson. Patients often swooned, sometimes shrieking, sometimes whispering prayers to saints whose intervention might stabilize the delicate ebb and flow of humors within them. Royal courts, in particular, clung to the practice with a fervent faith, believing that discipline of the flesh could align the spirit, that the bleeding of veins was a sacred act capable of restoring cosmic order. Families watched with bated breath, hearts heavy with hope and dread, while physicians moved methodically, their actions precise, their faces inscrutable beneath the hooded glow of candlelight. Yet the results were unpredictable. Some recovered, their fevers abating, their limbs gaining warmth once more, while others weakened, their blood draining, their strength evaporating into the silent shadows of the chamber. And still the ritual persisted, generation after generation, a testament to humanity's desire to command life through the art of suffering. Every drop shed became a meditation on mortality, a visible sign of the fragility of flesh, the impermanence of vitality, the eternal tension between control and surrender. The act of bloodletting was intimate, almost confessional, as the patient's hand twitched and pulse slowed, as the crimson river traced patterns upon white linen. One could sense the interplay of fear and trust, obedience and defiance, science and superstition. The room seemed to vibrate with unspoken questions. How far should the living reach to assert dominion over the body? At what cost does knowledge demand obedience? And in the quiet aftermath, when leeches had slithered back into glass bowls and the floor was wiped clean, the chamber remained a sacred space, haunted by the rhythm of heartbeats, the memory of blood spilled in hope and fear, in devotion and desperation. To modern eyes, bloodletting appears grotesque, a ritual of cruelty disguised as healing. Yet in its own time, it was a sacred rite, a bridge between life and death, knowledge and mystery, pain and salvation, in the dripping crimson, in the scent of iron and herbs, in the whispered prayers of patient and physician alike. The human desire to master fate, to bend mortality to will, is palpable. And as the candlelight flickers over centuries-old accounts, one feels the weight of those long-ago rooms, the silent testimony of every incision, every drop, and the haunting, almost sacred lesson that even in pain there may lie the fragile hope of restoration, and that the human body, in all its vulnerability, has long been a vessel for both suffering and the relentless pursuit of life. In that dim, trembling glow, where shadows clung to the walls and the faint rustle of linen marked the passage of time, it is impossible not to feel awe at the strange, delicate dance that was bloodletting. It is a ritual that asks of its participants faith, courage, and surrender, and in the echoes of history, the quiet reflection lingers. Life is fragile, yet we have always sought to bend it, to coax it with ritual, with touch, with the shedding of our own essence. Perhaps in the silence after the final cut, when the chamber is empty save for shadows, the true lesson is revealed that the boundaries between healing and harm, devotion and obsession, are as delicate and uncertain as the pulse beneath the skin, as fleeting and precious as life itself. The village lay shrouded in mist, the morning fog curling through narrow lanes and across thatched roofs like a living thing. Stone bridges glistened with dew, and the distant river whispered secrets to the hills beyond. It was a world in which every breath felt heavy with consequence, and every shadow might conceal unseen judgment. In this time, the 12th century, across the lands of Europe, justice was not merely measured by testimony, by law, or by conscience. It was measured by endurance, by fire, by water, by the will of forces both divine and terrifyingly immediate. Accusations traveled like whispers on the wind, reaching ears that trembled with fear. A man accused of theft, a woman suspected of transgression, a servant believed complicit in dishonor, all were brought forward, not to debate their guilt or innocence, but to confront the crucible of divine scrutiny. They were led barefoot to the river, to the hearth, to the altar, each step resonating with the collective heartbeat of the village. Eyes followed them, wide with anticipation, hands clutched in prayer, as the accused approached the trial by ordeal, the sacred, brutal, unyielding theater in which survival itself would speak the truth. In the case of the river, the accused was plunged into icy water, bound and weighted, and the congregation watched, silent, breath held, as the currents tugged and pulled. Some sank, some floated, some fought with frantic vigor, and every movement was interpreted as a sign, a verdict handed down not by mortal judges, but by an unseen hand. The will of God manifest in the freezing embrace of the water. In the fire ordeal, a metal rod was seared in flames until it glowed with white heat. The accused carried it, hands wrapped in cloth, steps trembling as flames licked the air. Burns and blisters were measured, examined after days of healing, and the patterns of scarred flesh spoke the truth, or, at least, the truth that the ritual demanded. The villagers murmured among themselves. The priests whispered incantations, their voices entwined with the crackling of fire and the rush of water. Anxiety and awe mingled in the air, a thick tension that seemed to press against the ribs. The accused faced not only physical trial, but a psychological one. The mind and body entwined in a test that demanded submission, courage, and unwavering faith. A wrong step, a slip of the hand, a faltering heart could mean condemnation, while endurance and resilience were interpreted as divine favor. These trials were terrifyingly intimate. Every eye watched, every heartbeat counted, every reaction noted. Pain became confession, endurance became evidence. Suffering became the language through which truth was measured. Even for the observers, the ordeal held a hypnotic pull, a sacred fascination that fused fear with belief, cruelty with devotion. Families whispered prayers for their loved ones. Children hid their faces, and the air itself seemed alive with anticipation and dread. In the quiet moments after, when the water stilled or the coals cooled, when the injured were tended and the innocent released, a reflective hush fell across the village. The trial, cruel and exacting, had done more than judge it had bound the community in a shared confrontation with mortality, morality, and the unseen powers believed to govern both. The scars, the swollen hands, the shivering bodies were sacred, reminders of the fragile balance between life and divine scrutiny. The trial by ordeal is a meditation upon the human condition, upon the intertwining of fear and faith, of suffering and judgment. It whispers across centuries that justice was never merely procedural, it was corporeal, ritualized, divine, and in the lingering silence, when only echoes of splashing water or crackling fire remain, one feels the weight of human frailty, the tenuous grasp of mortality, and the haunting understanding that the line between innocence and guilt may have always been measured not by words, but by the body's endurance beneath the gaze of eternity. In the chill of early January, long before the sun had risen high over the rolling hills of medieval France, the village churches stirred with a quiet anticipation. The air smelled of smoke and earth, mixed with the faint tang of livestock and the distant clatter of hooves on stone. The feast of the ass was at hand, a ritual both sacred and absurd, one that blurred the line between devotion and folly, between reverence and laughter. It was a celebration that transformed the ordinary into the extraordinary, where the lowly beast of burden, the humble donkey, became a symbol of divinity, humility, and the strange humor that humanity can infuse into faith. The streets filled gradually as villagers emerged from their homes, still wrapped in furs against the winter's bite. Children clung to the skirts of their mothers, eyes wide with expectation, while elders shuffled with solemn purpose, clutching prayer books and incense. Within the stone walls of the cathedral, the air thickened with candle smoke, its pale flicker reflecting against the worn wooden beams and faded frescoes of saints long forgotten. And then, in the midst of this mixture of anticipation and piety, a donkey appeared, draped in festive finery, its ears pricked, eyes reflecting both innocence and the weight of ritual. Atop its back sat a figure representing Mary or Joseph, a fragile statue or costumed acolyte. Lifted into a procession that would wind through the stone-clad streets, the villagers followed, chanting psalms and singing hymns, their voices blending with the bray of the animal in an unsettling, sacred chorus. Laughter mingled with reverence. Joy and solemnity were braided together in a single thread, a living testament to humanity's desire to touch the divine with both awe and humor. Masks glinted in the candlelight, hands waved incense into the air, and the scent of straw, hay, and animal sweat became inseparable from the sacred atmosphere. Every footstep of the donkey on the cobblestones echoed through the narrow lanes, each spray a punctuation in the unfolding theater of faith and folly. The procession was not without its tension. Children stumbled, startled by the sudden bray or the unexpected sway of the animal. Elders prayed silently, some fearing that the absurdity of the ritual might invite divine displeasure. Yet the spectacle persisted, a careful choreography between chaos and order. The sacred and the profane intertwined like ivy climbing the cathedral walls. Observers could not look away, eyes widened in delight and bewilderment alike, hearts pounding, with the shared rhythm of anticipation, fear, and amusement. By the time the procession returned to the church, the donkey was led to the sanctuary, where clergy and laity offered prayers and blessings. The ceremony closed with solemnity. Yet a quiet hum of joy lingered in the air, a recognition that faith could be both profound and playful. The Feast of the Ass was a paradox, a ritual that honored humility through spectacle, devotion through laughter, and the divine through the lowliest of creatures. In the long silence that followed, after the animals had been led away and the last candle had guttered, one could still sense the pulse of the ritual lingering in the stone and air. The streets seemed to remember the echo of hooves and voices, the strange communion of reverence and whimsy. The Feast of the Ass whispers across centuries, reminding us that faith is not always solemn, that the sacred can dwell in the unexpected, and that laughter, like prayer, has long been a bridge between the human and the divine. It is a story of humility and joy, of ritual that binds community and belief, and of a moment in time when a simple animal carried not only figures of devotion, but the weight of human wonder, absurdity, and reverent imagination. In the quiet halls of European courts, where candlelight flickered against polished wood and stone, and the air smelled of wax, incense, and the faint perfume of old velvet, a different kind of devotion took shape, a devotion to the memory of death itself. From the 14th century onward, nobles, artisans, and commoners alike began to embrace a practice that would seem macabre to modern eyes, yet in its time was both sacred and contemplative. Memento mori, the art of remembering that all flesh is fleeting, that the shadow of mortality stretches over every heartbeat, every joy, every ambition. Rooms were adorned with delicate carvings of skulls, rings were fashioned from bone, paintings bore the skeletal visage of saints, nobles, and loved ones alike. Even portraits of the living were accompanied by subtle reminders, an hourglass tipped in shadow, a candle guttering low, a skull half hidden beneath drapery. These were not tokens of morbidity for amusement alone, they were tools of meditation, instruments to compel the heart to remember the impermanence of existence. In candlelit chambers, courtiers might sip wine, discuss politics, and yet their eyes would inevitably fall upon the carved visage of a skull, a silent witness to every word, every ambition, every fleeting triumph. The practice extended beyond decoration. People wore rings carved from the bones of ancestors, garments were embroidered with tiny skeletons, and during certain feasts, bones were displayed in a quiet ritual of remembrance. There was a paradoxical intimacy in this communion with death. One confronted decay, frailty, and the inevitability of loss not in secret, but in daily, conscious awareness. In the stillness of private chambers, one might trace the contours of a carved jawbone or brush a finger over the painted hollows of an eye socket, feeling the weight of centuries, the whispered advice of those who had already walked the narrow path from life to shadow. Society moved around these objects as if guided by them. Conversations, alliances, and rivalries were all subtly refracted through the lens of mortality. The presence of the dead among the living was a constant, silent reminder that power, beauty, and wealth were transient, that the ambitions of men and women were but fleeting echoes in a world ultimately indifferent to desire. For some, this practice inspired humility. For others, it provoked a secret thrill, a sense of communion with forces greater than the ephemeral concerns of daily life. The most profound moments occurred in candlelit reflection, when the flicker of flame cast dancing shadows across a skeletal carving, and the observer felt both fear and awe, an intimate connection to the unbroken chain of mortality. Death was not merely an end, but a companion, a teacher, a guide whose lessons could be glimpsed in bone, paint, and carved wood. The ritual demanded attention, presence, and an acceptance that no flesh, no matter how noble or powerful, could evade the quiet inevitability awaiting all. Even today, in the hush of museums or the quiet corners of ancient chapels, one can feel the lingering power of memento mori, the carved bones, the painted skulls, the rings and relics, each whisper across centuries that life is precious, fragile, and impermanent. The practice is a meditation on humility, a dialogue between the living and the dead, a sacred recognition of the fleeting rhythm of existence. And as the candle guttering throws shadows across a cold wall, one senses the echo of countless hearts who have stared into mortality, who have carried the reminder close, who have woven the inevitable into the tapestry of daily life, and in doing so, have transformed fear into reverent reflection, and the shadow of death into an enduring companion of the soul. The square of a Catalan village awakens to the low hum of anticipation. The soft murmur of villagers stirring before dawn. Mist curls along the stone steps of the town, wrapping around the ancient walls like a shroud, and the scent of wet earth and roasting bread mingles with the crisp chill of early morning. It is a world suspended between fear and devotion, between communal pride and the precarious balance of human endurance. Here, for centuries, the people of Catalonia have gathered to build human towers, castles as high as the eye can see, a ritual that is as much a meditation on trust as it is a test of courage. The first men assemble, broad shoulders braced, feet pressing into the worn stone of the plaza. Their muscles flex, sinew tight, skin damp with exertion or morning mist. Layer upon layer forms as others climb, balancing on shoulders and necks. The weight of lives pressing downward in a delicate, living architecture. Each movement is precise, yet fragile, each breath measured, each heartbeat synchronized with the rhythm of the tower. The air is thick with anticipation, the kind that makes the lungs ache before the body has even begun. A misstep can spell injury, humiliation, or disaster, yet the participants move forward, bound by ritual, pride, and a silent, shared faith in one another. Children, perched at the pinnacle, tremble with the weight of history and expectation. Their tiny hands cling to arms and shoulders, to ropes and faith alike, balancing between triumph and terror. Below, the adults strain, faces slick with sweat, bodies quivering with tension, as every muscle must align perfectly to sustain the living monument. The crowd watches, breathless, an entire village united in suspense and devotion, murmuring prayers and blessings that mingle with the shouts and encouragement of those forming the base. The tower sways with the wind, a living thing, a fragile bridge between earth and sky. There is a silence that settles over the square at the moment of completion, a shared awareness that for a brief, luminous instant, humanity has achieved something almost impossible. Then, as the children descend and the adults relax their tense holds, laughter and tears mingle. A chorus of relief, awe, and quiet reverence. The ritual is complete, yet its impact lingers, etched into memory, into the arches of the plaza, into the sinews and bones of those who took part. The human tower is more than spectacle. It is an expression of communal trust, of courage born from necessity and devotion. It is a meditation on the limits of flesh and spirit, a celebration of balance between fragility and strength. The ritual carries a sacred rhythm. Each heartbeat, each strained breath, each whispered word is part of a silent prayer to forces both visible and unseen, to courage, to perseverance, to the collective human spirit. Even when the square empties, when the fog drifts away and only the stones remain, the memory of the living tower lingers. It whispers of human ambition and daring, of the delicate trust required to hold one another aloft, and of the enduring beauty of rituals that remind us that life is precarious, fleeting, and yet capable of transcending the ordinary through devotion, courage, and unity. The castles of Catalonia stand as a testament to the human desire to reach beyond, to climb higher, and to touch something eternal, if only for a moment suspended in the delicate balance of flesh, fear, and faith. The highlands of Scotland are often veiled in mist, a perpetual gray that drapes the hills and valleys like a mourning shroud. Sheep graze silently on slopes where shadows gather, and the wind whispers through gnarled trees, carrying stories long forgotten. Here, in the cold and wild reaches of the land, there exist paths that are not meant for the living alone. Known as corpse roads, they stretch between villages and distant burial grounds. Narrow trails carved by necessity and fear, by superstition and devotion. They are the silent arteries of death, where the dead are carried across hills and moors, and where the living follow, bound by duty, grief, and a quiet dread that lingers like fog. Families would gather at dawn, shrouded bodies wrapped in linen, their faces hidden beneath hoods or veils. The pallbearers, chosen for their strength and endurance, lifted the corpse with reverent care, each step measured against the uneven stones and muddy tracks. Villagers whispered prayers under their breath, invoking saints to guard the souls of the departed and to shield the living from the malevolent spirits said to haunt these paths. Some believed that spirits of the dead, unable to find rest, lingered along the road, threatening the living with misfortune or illness. Others insisted that careful observance, reverence, and ritual could guide the deceased safely to consecrated ground. The journey was a negotiation between mortality and the supernatural, a liminal passage where the boundary between life and death thinned with every step. Fog clung to the earth, curling around knees and ankles, muting sound except for the soft shuffle of feet, the creak of stretched linen, the faint sighs of those who bore both the living weight of sorrow and the dead weight of the body before them. In moments of stillness, one could hear the wind teasing through heather and bracken, a mournful melody that seemed to echo the cries of the dead themselves. Villagers pressed forward with a mixture of determination and fear, aware that a misstep could dishonor the journey, could invite malevolence into their homes, could leave the soul of the departed wandering in restless limbo. Some corpse roads climbed steep hills where stones jutted like teeth, or skirted dark forests where the shadows deepened unnaturally. Pilgrims and mourners often recited psalms, their voices trembling, merging with the sigh of the wind and the distant call of a raven. Children clutched their parents' hands, learning early that death was not merely an abstraction, but a presence, a companion on a path that demanded attention, courage, and ritual respect. The dead, though silent, seemed to guide the living, their weight a reminder of fragility and continuity, of grief and responsibility intertwined. At the journey's end, when the burial ground was reached, the air often seemed lighter, the mist lifting as though in acknowledgement of completion. The corpse was lowered with care, shrouds adjusted, prayers offered, and earth replaced upon flesh. Yet even in rest, the path retained its memory, the stones remembered the footsteps, the fog the whispers, and the hills the delicate dance of life and death that had passed through them. The corpse roads of Scotland are a meditation on mortality, on the intimate partnership between the living and the dead, and on the subtle ways in which human communities honor, fear, and navigate the inevitability of death. They whisper asterisk across centuries that grief is not merely private sorrow, but a ritualized journey, a sacred performance, a confrontation with the ephemeral nature of life itself. Even now, when modern roads cut through these hills, when the dead are transported in silence and machines replace the careful steps of mourners, the memory of the corpse roads lingers like a shadow, a quiet reminder that the living are forever bound to the dead, that journeys of grief can shape the land itself, and that the thin line between life and death is walked with reverence, dread, and unspoken devotion, step by careful step. The fjords of Scandinavia lie in stillness, their dark waters reflecting jagged cliffs and the pale winter sun, like mirrors suspended between earth and sky. Pine forests whisper with the wind, and the scent of smoke drifts faintly from distant hearths, carrying with it the aroma of peat and wood. In the Viking Age, these lands were not merely inhabited, they were watched, revered, and feared, alive, with gods and spirits who lingered in the cold shadows of mountains, rivers, and forests. Here, death was not a quiet passage, but a grand, fiery spectacle, a ritual in which honor and eternity were measured by the flames that consumed flesh. And what alike, when a warrior of no past from life, the village stirred in preparation. Ships, often carved with intricate designs of serpents and beasts, were hauled to the shores, their hulls polished and laden with treasures, weapons, and garments meant for the afterlife. The body of the deceased was laid upon the vessel, adorned in finery and war gear, a testament to the life lived, the battles fought, and the honor claimed. Families, friends, and fellow warriors gathered in solemn assembly, the air thick with incense, blood, and the iron tang of grief. The sky seemed to hold its breath, and the fjord waters mirrored the collective anticipation of the assembled mourners. As the pyre was set ablaze, flames lit at the wooden sides of the ship, crackling and hissing, casting dancing shadows across the faces of those who watched. The heat pressed against the skin, smoke filled the lungs, and yet no one moved from their place, bound by ritual, devotion, and the reverent awe inspired by the spectacle. Warriors shouted honorifics, women wept quietly, and children clutched the hems of cloaks, witnessing an end that was also a beginning. The fire consumed flesh and timber alike, transforming mortality into smoke, and carrying the essence of the deceased to the heavens, perhaps to Odin, perhaps to the vast unknown beyond the fjord. Even in its destruction, the funeral pyre was intimate. Survivors felt the tremor of flames through the ground, smelled the sweet and bitter mingling of burning wood and human sorrow, and understood the delicate paradox of loss and celebration. This ritual was not merely a farewell, it was a bridge, a sacred passage, a way of ensuring that courage, honor, and the memory of deeds would not vanish with the body. Every crackle, every hiss of the flames, every plume of smoke that spiraled into the sky was a language of devotion, grief, and eternal respect, spoken without words, but understood by all who bore witness. The ceremony left the fjord silent in its aftermath, save for the ripple of water against shore and the wind rustling pine. Yet even in quiet, the echoes of the pyre remain the memory of fire, the scent of smoke, the shadow of lives lifted into legend. The Viking funeral was a meditation on mortality, on the transient beauty of flesh, and on the enduring power of ritual to sanctify death. It whispered to the living that honor is not measured solely in life, but also in the dignity of departure, that the passage from earth to eternity can be both terrifying and sacred, even centuries later. When the fjords lie in winter stillness, one can imagine the shimmer of flames reflected on dark waters, the collective breath of mourners caught between grief and reverence, and the silent ascent of spirit into unknown skies. The Viking funeral pyres remind us that death, when embraced with courage, ritual, and attention, can become both spectacle and meditation, a sacred bridge between what is fleeting and what endures, a reminder that the living are forever shaped by the ceremonies they witness, and that even in the consuming fire of loss, there is a kind of eternal illumination. The quiet streets of medieval London were often lined with the scent of smoke, the tang of livestock, and the chatter of merchants preparing for the day. Yet once a year, a more subtle, sacred ritual would unfold, one that balanced precision, authority, and superstition, at which demanded attention from the very heart of the realm. It was the trial of the pyx, a ceremony that tested the integrity of the coinage. But beneath its practical purpose lay layers of ritual, hierarchy, and the uncanny sense that even the smallest object could carry the weight of trust, authority, and fate. The pyx itself, a chest filled with newly minted coins, was brought forth from the Tower of London, a heavy, wooden vessel bound with iron and mystery. Officials, wardens of the mint, and representatives of the crown gathered in their ceremonial robes, hands trembling with both pride and the solemnity of responsibility. Clerks, goldsmiths, and accountants approached with careful steps, aware that the eyes of God and of the king were metaphorically upon them. Each coin was examined with meticulous attention, laid out on velvet tables, weighed and tested against standards that were as precise as they were unyielding. The chamber smelled faintly of beeswax and metal, and the candlelight reflected off the polished surfaces, creating shifting patterns that seemed alive, almost conspiratorial. Every scratch, every irregularity was noted, and a subtle tension permeated the air. The ritual was a negotiation between human diligence and the invisible forces of chance and error. For while coins were small and ordinary, their integrity was the foundation of trust, of commerce, of life itself. A flaw could ripple through the kingdom, affecting trade, taxation, and confidence. Yet even beyond their material function, the coins carried symbolic weight, representing the authority of the crown and the fragile balance between order and disorder. The trial unfolded with deliberate ceremony. The chest opened, coins sorted, measured, tested, and weighed. Observers held their breath, aware that this seemingly mundane process was imbued with layers of sacred responsibility. The air was thick with unspoken questions. Had the miners been diligent? Had the hands of man introduced error? Would the kingdom's commerce falter because of a small miscalculation? Each coin, though cold and lifeless, seemed to pulse with consequence, a tiny vessel of both human endeavor and collective fate. By the end of the ceremony, judgments were recorded, standards confirmed, and the chest resealed. Candles guttered, murmurs of relief passed through the chamber, and the officials departed, leaving behind an echo of meticulous care, vigilance, and ceremonial weight. The trial of the pyx was more than a test of metal. It was a meditation on trust, responsibility, and the intricate threads that bind human society together. Even centuries later, historians and numismatists marvel at the dedication, the precision, and the almost sacred attention to the minutiae of life that this ceremony demanded. The ritual reminds us that even the smallest objects, the ones most easily overlooked, can carry immense significance. Coins, stripped of material value, become symbols of order and reliability, and the ceremony surrounding them transforms ordinary metal into an object of reverence, a conduit for human care, fear, and aspiration. In the stillness of the chamber, one can imagine the candlelight flickering across ancient faces, the soft metallic chime of coins in hand, and the hum of a society that understood the delicate balance between trust and chaos, between attention and neglect. The trial of the pyx whispers across the centuries, a quiet testament to the ways in which humanity consecrates even the mundane, the ordinary, with ritual, reverence, and reflection. It is asterisk asterisk, a reminder that order is fragile, that responsibility extends to the smallest details, and that in every act of careful attention lies a sacred recognition of the interconnectedness of life, society, and the unseen forces that guide them in the dense, shadowed highlands of Madagascar, where mist clings to the hills like a living shroud and the scent of damp earth rises from the valleys. A different understanding of life and death takes hold. Here, among the Malagasy people, the veil between the living and the dead has always been thin, a membrane that ripples with memory, devotion, and fear. For centuries, they have practiced a ritual known as Famatahana, the turning of the bones, a ceremony that is both intimate and unsettling, a communion with ancestors that transforms decay into presence, absence into celebration. When a family prepares for Famatahana, the air is thick with anticipation, incense, and the soft cries of grief restrained by ritual. The bodies of ancestors, exhumed from their resting places, are wrapped in silk or cloth, carefully preserved through generations of care and devotion. They are lifted with reverence, their bones brushed clean, faces remembered through stories whispered between breaths. Villagers gather, drums tapping a slow, resonant rhythm, children clinging to the skirts of elders as the procession begins. The dead, once silent and distant, are carried through the village in a careful, deliberate parade, a reminder that memory and mortality are intertwined, that the past breathes in the present. Music and laughter rise into the mountains, a curious counterpoint to the eerie intimacy of the ritual. Songs honor ancestors, recounting their deeds, their trials, their virtues, and the young dance beside the long departed as though the barrier of death itself had softened. The scent of earth and incense mingles with the warmth of the sun, creating an atmosphere simultaneously sacred and disquieting for the living. Touching the bones, holding them close, is an act of both devotion and confrontation, a reminder that mortality is inevitable, yet memory is enduring. As the day progresses, the ancestors' remains are rewrapped in fresh cloth, blessed with prayers, and returned to their tombs. Yet the procession, the music, the laughter, and the whispered stories leave an echo that lingers long after the ceremony ends. In this ritual, death is not final, it is transformed into continuity, a bridge between generations, a living testimony to the bonds of family, memory, and respect. The dead, in a strange and solemn way, are present, commanding attention and devotion, reminding the living of their own fragile mortality. Famatahana is more than a cultural curiosity. It is a meditation on the intimacy of life and death, a sacred acknowledgement that the departed are never truly gone when memory, ritual, and devotion sustain them. The bones themselves, brushed, turned, and honored, whisper across centuries that the past shapes the present, that mortality need not be silent, and that even decay can be a vessel for connection, celebration, and reflection. When night falls over the highlands and the fog curls around the hills, one can imagine the drums fading into silence, the laughter giving way to quiet reflection, and the ancestors resting once more in their tombs, yet alive in memory, ritual, and story. In Famatahana, we are reminded that the human heart can hold the living and the dead together, and that the boundaries of mortality are not fixed, but can be bent by reverence, courage, and the enduring pulse of memory. On the volcanic slopes of Bali, where the scent of frangipani drifts through dense forests and smoke curls from countless temples, the living walk in tandem with death, honoring it as both an end and a passage. Here, for centuries, the Balinese have practiced ngabin, the ritual of cremation, a ceremony that is as grand as it is intimate, a dance between fire and spirit that ensures the soul's journey beyond the mortal coil. In villages shadowed by temples and carved stone, the dead are not hidden in grief, but carried aloft, their presence acknowledged with reverence, song, and an almost tangible breath of awe. Preparation begins days in advance, with the construction of elaborate cremation towers, bamboo and palm fronds woven into towering, ornate structures that gleam like fragile fire itself. Effigies, statues, and offerings accompany the deceased, ensuring that all worldly attachments are honored before they are released. Families and friends gather, wrapped in sarongs, their faces a mixture of solemnity and anticipation as drums begin a slow, resonant rhythm that vibrates through the earth and into the hearts of those assembled. Smoke rises from incense, mingling with the scent of flowers and earth, a perfumed mist that softens grief into something sacred. When the moment arrives, the body is lifted onto the pyre or carried through the village in ceremonial procession. Villagers chant and sing, their voices weaving with the rhythmic pulse of drums, guiding the soul toward liberation. Children watch, wide-eyed, as the elders move with precision, bearing the weight of the dead and the weight of ritual alike. Fire is set, flames leaping and consuming the wooden towers, twisting offerings into smoke and carrying both grief and devotion into the sky. The heat presses against the skin of the living, yet their hearts remain centered, tethered to the rhythm of prayer, song, and the steady ascent of the smoke. Engraving is not merely cremation, it is a dialogue between life and death, an acknowledgement that the body is temporary while the soul persists. The ritual is both collective and personal. The community bears witness, guides, and participates, while the family engages in intimate acts of care and farewell. Each step, each song, each flame is a meditation on impermanence, a recognition of mortality that transforms fear into devotion, grief into beauty, and ending into passage. Even after the towers have collapsed into ashes, and the smoke has dissipated into the clouds above the volcanoes, the ritual lingers in the consciousness of the village. It whispers that death is not to be hidden, that grief is not a silence to be endured alone, and that life and memory are strengthened through deliberate, sacred acts of recognition. The soul, guided by fire and devotion, rises, while the living are left with a profound reminder that mortality can be honored, celebrated, and transformed into a bridge between the ephemeral and the eternal. In the quiet of night, when only the cinders remain and the scent of incense hangs in the air, one can imagine the ancestors walking through the smoke, liberated and yet present, reminding the living that death is not absence but transition, and that ritual, song, and fire can render the fleeting eternal, if only for a heartbeat suspended between earth and sky. In the labyrinthine canals of Venice, where the water reflects the golden shimmer of lanterns and the sky is stitched with the silhouettes of bell towers, a city transforms each winter into a world of shadow, silk, and secret selves. The Venetian Carnival is more than celebration. It is a ritual of disguise, a deliberate blurring of identity, a dance between freedom and concealment that has persisted for centuries. Masks, painted and gilded, hide the contours of the face, yet reveal the contours of desire, ambition, and the unspoken whims of the human heart. The narrow alleyways hum with anticipation as townsfolk and travelers alike slip into the ornate costumes of the festival. Velvet cloaks brush against cobblestones, feathers sway in candlelight, and every step echoes off ancient stone, carrying with it the weight of intrigue, secrecy, and possibility. Behind each mask, 1,000 stories hide, forbidden love, whispered plots, debts repaid or exacted, identities exchanged like fragile coins. In the flicker of lamplight, one cannot tell master from servant, noble from commoner, saint from sinner, and in this ambiguity lies the power of the carnival, a temporary inversion of social order sanctioned by tradition and festivity. Balls unfold in palaces where frescoed ceilings seem to shimmer with the ghosts of past revelers, each chamber alive with music, laughter, and the soft tension of secrets unspoken. Dancers move with precision, every gesture both elegant and guarded, every glance potentially a message encoded in the language of the masked. The air is perfumed with candle smoke, musk, and the faint tang of spiced wine, each breath carrying with it the thrill of anonymity and the allure of hidden truths. Some masks are grotesque, exaggerating features into caricature, while others are delicate, almost invisible, revealing only the suggestion of a face behind paint and silk. Yet beneath the revelry lies a quiet tension, a recognition that the mask is not merely a disguise but a challenge to perception. Behind it, one may discover courage, malice, or vulnerability. The wearer becomes both observer and observed, actor, an audience in a drama that blurs the boundary between reality and performance. Deals are struck, alliances formed, and hearts captivated, all under the subtle tyranny of anonymity that the carnival enforces. In its temporality, the festival becomes a mirror reflecting desires, fears, and ambitions that everyday life conceals beneath routine and propriety. When dawn breaks over the canals and the masks are removed, the magic lingers and echoes. The scent of perfume, the soft rustle of silk, the faint shimmer of candle wax harden in place. The city resumes its rhythm, yet the memory of the carnival persists. A delicate tension between secrecy and revelation, freedom and constraint, appearance and truth. The Venetian masks whisper a lesson across centuries, that identity is fragile, that society itself is a performance, and that beneath every mask lies a shadow, a secret, a possibility both thrilling and perilous. To wander Venice during the carnival is to inhabit a world suspended between reality and myth, where the mask allows the heart to speak in ways ordinary life forbids, and where every glance, every gesture, every hidden smile carries with it the quiet reminder that human desire, cunning, and imagination are boundless. And even after the last candle gutters and the streets empty, the city seems to remember the masked revelers, as if each shadow, each reflection in the canal, holds a fragment of the stories that unfolded, suspended forever in the delicate twilight of mystery, performance, and silent reverence. The fjords and forests of Norway are often silent, cloaked in mist and shadow, yet for the Vikings, silence could be deceptive. Beneath the stillness, the pulse of fear, vengeance, and ritual coursed like a hidden river, and among the most terrifying of their rites was the so-called blood eagle, a practice whispered across centuries. Draped in legend, fear, and the stark geometry of cruelty, it was said to be an execution both ceremonial and brutal, a sacred punishment that transformed vengeance into spectacle, flesh into emblem, and mortality into a warning. The victim, often a rival chieftain or traitor, was bound and laid upon a table carved from ancient oak, its grain worn smooth by generations of ritual use. The air was heavy with smoke from burning pine, mingling with the metallic tang of blood, and the assembled warriors watched in tense anticipation, their faces illuminated by flickering torches. Silence held the fjord, broken only by the occasional gust of wind through pine boughs, carrying a faint echo of waves crashing against distant rocks. The ritual was both public and intimate, a meditation on the fragility of life, the gravity of vengeance, and the thin line separating law, myth, and terror. As the executioner prepared, the ritual became a choreography of fear and obedience. Blades glinted in torchlight, sharp and unforgiving, and the mechanics of the rite, whether literal or symbolic, were executed with precision. The victim's back was laid open and, according to the chronicles, the ribs severed and spread, the lungs drawn outward to resemble wings, an emblem of flight, perhaps, but of flight into death. Every movement was deliberate, each strike both functional and symbolic, a language of pain, warning, and ritualized authority. The assembled watched, knowing that this was not mere punishment, but a sacred enactment, a story told in flesh and blood that would echo through generations. Legends vary, and historians debate the accuracy of the blood eagle. Yet even in myth it embodies something profound, the human fascination with mortality, the interplay of justice and terror, and the power of ritual to transform fear into story. It whispers that vengeance is not always private, that cruelty can be codified into sacred form, and that the body, once the vessel of life, can become a canvas for both moral instruction and mythic narrative. The fjord remains silent long after the torches gutter, the smoke dissipates, and the echoes of cries fade into memory. Yet in the dark woods, in the turning mist, one feels the lingering tension of life and death intertwined, the awe and terror that human societies have long invested in ritual. The blood eagle, real or imagined, reminds us that mortality has always been a canvas for power, fear, and devotion, that vengeance can be sacred and horrifying simultaneously, and that even in the shadow of myth, the pulse of human imagination beats strongest in the spaces between life and death. It is a meditation on cruelty, ritual, and the human need to render the incomprehensible into form. And as the fjord waters shimmer in moonlight, reflecting silent trees and distant mountains, one senses the whisper of centuries past, that life is fragile, that justice can be terrifyingly literal, and that in every ritual of death, humanity confronts both its deepest fears and its desire to give them shape, story, and meaning. The forests of early modern Europe were alive with shadows, where the gnarled trunks of ancient trees seemed to twist in silent accusation, and the wind carried whispers of secrets best left unspoken. In the 16th and 17th centuries, rumor and fear coiled through villages and hamlets like a living thing, and in this charged atmosphere, the notion of the witch's Sabbath took hold. A gathering said to convene under the cloak of night, where mortals consorted with the dark, and the boundaries between the human and the supernatural blurred into a terrifying dance. Those accused of witchcraft were often women, though not exclusively, and they were both feared and envied. Their knowledge of herbs, the stars, and the body seen as a power to be restrained. The stories describe midnight gatherings, deep in the forest, where the accused would ride brooms or leap upon goats, their faces masked, bodies draped in shadow, and voices raised in chants incomprehensible to the rational world. Candles flickered in hidden glades, illuminating the ritual circle, and the air was thick with smoke from herbs burned as incense, a mixture of sweet and acrid, both purifying and hallucinogenic. Villagers claimed to see flashes of movement between the trees, silhouettes against the moonlight, and to hear laughter and shrieks that belonged neither to the living nor the dead. In these legends, the Sabbath was both revelry and terror. The witches were said to dance around cauldrons of unknown substances, call upon spirits, and enact pacts with forces unseen. Some accounts describe flights rising into the air, carried by unseen hands or by magical contrivance. Others describe the consumption of mysterious powders, the sharing of charms, and rites that tested both courage and obedience. The narrative of the Sabbath served as a lens for societal anxieties, the fear of the unknown, the threat of subversion, the tension between natural law and supernatural interference. Yet behind every shriek, every rumor, lay kernels of truth, the very real persecution of women, the fascination with forbidden knowledge, and the thin line between wisdom and accusation. Authorities and churchmen, convinced of the existence of such gatherings, sought to punish them through trials, torture, and execution. Confessions extracted under duress painted elaborate to blow of flight, feasts, and pacts with the devil. Entire communities were swept into hysteria, and the shadow of the Sabbath spread, leaving a legacy of fear, suspicion, and profound tragedy. Villagers whispered of the midnight meetings, of vanished animals, of strange lights over the forest, and the memory of these tales endured, passing into legend, cautionary story, and myth. Even centuries later, one can imagine the forest at night, the wind threading through the trees, the rustle of leaves, the faint trace of smoke and herbs, and the unshakable sense that something unseen watches. The witch's Sabbath is more than folklore. It is a meditation on fear, power, and the human need to render the inexplicable into narrative. It is a reflection on the fragility of perception, the terror of difference, and the ways in which imagination, superstition, and societal anxiety converge into ritualized myth. In the moonlight, the forest seems to remember the whispers of those accused, the cries of the terrified, and the laughter of those said to dance with shadows. The Sabbath reminds us that human belief can create reality, that fear can sculpt society, and that stories, once born, linger like smoke among the trees, neither fully grasped nor fully forgotten. It is a caution, a reflection, and a haunting meditation. The human mind, when confronted with the unknown, will always seek ritual, narrative, and meaning even in the darkness. The halls of Renaissance courts gleamed with polished stone, gilded mirrors, and the soft glimmer of candlelight. Yet beneath their splendor lingered shadows that none could fully illuminate. In these palaces of power, where diplomacy and desire intertwine with envy and ambition, the poisoned cup became both metaphor and instrument, a vessel through which trust and betrayal converged, where the delicate balance of life could be shattered in a single sip. The allure of courtly intrigue, of whispered alliances and secret grudges, transformed every banquet into a theater of suspense, where every goblet held not just wine, but the potential for sudden, silent death. Courtiers dressed in silk and velvet moved with practiced elegance, hands gloved, gestures measured, yet eyes scanning, always scanning, for signs of duplicity. The scent of spiced wine, roasted meats, and incense mingled with the subtler, metallic hint of fear that floated unseen in the air. Stories of poisonings traveled through these corridors, whispered from servant to noble, from advisor to monarch, until the idea of the cup itself became a talisman of mortality. Cups carved from precious metals, inlaid with gems, or etched with intricate designs were chosen with care, for it was believed that the vessel itself could reflect the intentions of those who handled it, harboring both honor and malice in equal measure. Some poisoned cups were administered with subtlety, the effect slow, almost imperceptible, a cough, a pallor that deepened over hours, until the victim collapsed with the sudden inevitability of fate. Others were cruelly immediate, a single draught bringing convulsions, foam, and the shattering silence of death. Physicians, often complicit or powerless, could do little as the body betrayed the mind. Unraveling beneath the weight of unseen toxins, each case became legend. A duke felled before a council, a princess silenced before her wedding, an advisor undone in the flicker of candlelight. Tales of clever antidotes, secret poisons, and the deadly art of tasting cups passed from hand to hand, a grim curriculum for those who survived and observed. Yet the poisoned cup was more than an instrument of murder. It was a mirror reflecting human desire, fear, and ambition. Every banquet, every toast, every clink of crystal became an interplay between trust and suspicion, Between civility and violence, courtiers learned to read lips, gestures, and glances with the precision of seers. The slightest tremor of hand or flicker of eye could reveal intention, and the invisible language of suspicion governed every movement within the gilded walls. Death, like elegance, became ritualized, performed with grace yet underpinned by tension, that rippled through the very air. Long after the tables were cleared, the cups washed, and the wine spilled into the drain, the echo of the poisoned chalice remained. The hall seemed to remember each betrayal, each whispered warning, each life extinguished in silence. The ritual of the cup whispers across centuries, a meditation on human ambition, mortality, and the fragile trust upon which society is built. It is a reminder that even in splendor, danger walks beside desire, that elegance may conceal malice, and that mortality can be administered as delicately as a drink poured from silver into crystal. In the quiet of abandoned banquet halls, when moonlight casts pale reflections upon polished stone, one can imagine the trembling hands of courtiers, the measured gestures of monarchs, and the subtle, terrifying knowledge that at any moment, a sip could transform life into legend and desire into death. The poisoned cup endures as a symbol of the fragility of trust, the inevitability of betrayal, and the human compulsion to ritualize fear, power, and mortality into forms both terrifying and beautiful. Villages in medieval Europe were draped in mist and shadow, the thatched roofs and narrow lanes holding the secrets of countless generations. Here, beneath the watchful eyes of priests, judges, and elders, justice was not always measured by evidence or argument, but by ritual, by the belief that the divine could intervene in human affairs. Trial by ordeal was a practice both terrifying and sacred, a way to let God's hand weigh truth against falsehood, innocence against guilt and flesh against fate. When a case was brought before the village or cathedral, the accused would stand trembling, their eyes wide beneath hoods or veils, heart pounding against ribs like a captive bird. The crime might have been theft, treachery, or suspicion of witchcraft, and the penalty, whether determined or feared, hovered over them like a specter. The ordeal could take many forms: a hand plunged into boiling water to retrieve a stone, the accused made to hold a red-hot iron, or cast into the river to see whether the currents would claim them. Each method was a negotiation with both courage and divinity, a perilous bridge between mortal understanding and the inscrutable will of God. The onlookers watched with bated breath. Families clutched one another, villagers whispered prayers, and the priests murmured incantations that mingled with the hiss of boiling water or the rush of river currents. Every heartbeat seemed amplified, echoing in the minds of those gathered, as the accused faced a test that was part physical, part spiritual, and entirely human in its terror. Pain and fear became instruments of revelation, tools through which divine justice might be revealed. Observers believed that if the accused emerged unscathed, innocence was proven. If not, the verdict was writ in the very flesh of the human body. Yet even as the ordeal unfolded, a haunting ambiguity persisted. The trials were cruel, often fatal, and the notion that the divine would intervene remained a fragile hope. Those who survived bore scars not only on skin, but on memory, living with the proof of innocence etched in pain, a reminder that justice in medieval Europe was inseparable from ritual, fear, and the human need to see moral order reflected in tangible, sometimes horrific, form. Long after the water stilled, the iron cooled, and the onlookers departed, the air seemed to hold the residue of those trials, the echo of screams, the sigh of relief, and the silent question of how much of justice was divine and how much was the design of human hands. Trial by ordeal endures as a meditation on faith, mortality, and the fragile intersection of belief and brutality. It reminds us that history often demanded courage in its rawest form, that rituals could sanctify terror, and that in the unflinching gaze of spectators, life and death were intertwined in ways both sacred and chilling. Even now, standing in the shadowed ruins of village churches, one can imagine the tremor of the accused, the whisper of prayers, and the hush of the crowd. The ordeal whispers a truth across centuries, that justice, fear, and faith are entwined, that the body can bear witness to moral truth, and that human societies have long sought the hand of the divine to sanction, to reveal, and to guide. In the stillness, the echoes of trials remain a haunting reflection of the ways in which humanity has confronted uncertainty, mortality, and the unyielding quest for order in a world that is often chaotic, perilous, and inexplicably just. The streets of medieval Europe were cloaked in a pall of fear, the stench of decay and illness rising from alleys slick with rain and rot. When the plague swept through towns and villages, it moved with silent, indiscriminate terror, turning hearths into tombs and familiar faces into specters of suffering. In response, a figure emerged both grotesque and sacred, the plague doctor, robed in waxed cloth, wooden staff in hand, and most strikingly, the mask of beak-like visage designed to hold fragrant herbs, spices, and resins against the stench of death. They became symbols of protection and dread, both healers and omens. Walking the line between life and the relentless shadow of pestilence, the mask, with its hollow eyes and elongated beak, transformed the human face into something otherworldly. It was an instrument of survival, but also a warning, signaling the presence of disease and the fragile boundary between the living and the dead. Wax coats covered limbs, gloves encased hands, and boots clomped along cobblestones slick with rain, blood, or the remnants of fevered decay. The doctor's staff, long and polished, tapped rhythmically against doors and floors, both a tool of measurement and a talisman to ward off evil spirits believed to carry contagion. Villagers recoiled or bowed as the doctors passed, eyes wide with fear and reverence, recognizing in these figures a strange intersection of knowledge, superstition, and mortality. Inside the homes of the afflicted, the doctors worked with meticulous care, recording symptoms, administering herbal remedies, and observing the progression of the disease. Their eyes, hidden behind glass or horn, watched silently as flesh deteriorated and breath faltered. Yet even in their intervention, the aura of ritual persisted. The staff was raised in blessing or threat, herbs were crushed with deliberate rhythm, and the scent of aromatic mixtures filled the air, a talisman against invisible death. The beak mask, grotesque yet purposeful, served as both armor and symbol, a reminder that humanity, confronted by forces beyond comprehension, fashions instruments to negotiate survival. Even as fear saturates every gesture, outside, the streets remained hushed, punctuated by the distant wails of mourning and the clatter of feet carrying news, coffins, and despair. The plague doctor moved like a shadow between life and death, an embodiment of human ingenuity, ritual, and mortality. Their presence was haunting, a meditation on the limits of knowledge, the omnipresence of death, and the delicate, terrifying balance between survival and surrender. Long after the plague subsided, the image of the beak mask lingered, etched into memory and imagination. It whispered of fear and devotion, of the human impulse to confront invisible forces with visible symbols, and of the intricate rituals we construct to render chaos understandable. Even now, in quiet museums or the shadowed corners of medieval streets, one can imagine the echo of boots on cobblestones, the weight of wax cloaks, and the solemn rhythm of a staff tapping against door frames, a haunting testament to humanity's enduring struggle to negotiate life, death, and the fragile hope that survival is possible even in the shadow of the unimaginable. In the rolling hills and dense forests of Eastern Europe, there exist places where mortality is not hidden behind walls, but displayed, arranged, and reverently preserved. Among the most haunting are the bone churches of regions like the Czech Republic and Romania, chapels constructed, in part, from the remains of the departed. These sacred spaces are both devotional and unsettling, where skulls, femurs, and vertebrae are arranged in patterns that are as intricate as they are solemn, speaking to a civilization that sought to reconcile death, faith, and memory in tangible form. Entering such a chapel is to step into a world suspended between reverence and awe. The air is heavy with the scent of old wood, candle smoke, and the faint metallic tang of earth long disturbed. Light filters through stained glass, illuminating the bones in a soft, spectral glow, turning skulls into silent witnesses and femurs into pillars of contemplation. Ceilings may be strung with chandeliers fashioned from vertebrae, walls lined with skulls peering silently across centuries, and every arrangement is deliberate, a meditation on both mortality and the transience of earthly life. Visitors and parishioners alike are confronted with the intimacy of death, the human skeleton, stripped of flesh, yet imbued with the lingering essence of life, devotion, and community. These ossuaries often grew over centuries. Plague, war, and famine left populations in need of sacred space for the dead, and bones were exhumed, cleaned, and arranged into artistic, devotional displays. The living participated in this process, their hands both careful and trembling as they transformed decay into art, terror into meditation, and absence into a presence that could guide the spirit of the departed and remind the living of their own mortality. The act was as much ritual as practical necessity, each skull, each arrangement, a testament to the reverent attention paid to lives that had ended. yet whose memory remained woven into the fabric of the community. The chapels whisper across centuries, telling tales of devotion, suffering, and the extraordinary ways in which humans confront impermanence. One can imagine candlelight flickering across walls of bone, the quiet footsteps of the living moving reverently through the space, and the faint, almost imperceptible echo of voices long silenced. Here, death is transformed from something to fear into something to witness, to honor, and to meditate upon. Even now, the bone churches stand, silent yet eloquent, as reminders that mortality is universal, memory is sacred, and ritual can render absence tangible. They speak not only of the inevitability of death, but of the human capacity to transform fear into reverence, decay into art, and grief into reflection. As candlelight dances across skulls and femurs, one can feel the fragile boundary between life and death and understand that in these spaces, the departed are never truly gone. They endure in pattern, shadow, and silence, guiding the living to a contemplation of their own fleeting existence and the enduring power of remembrance. In the shadowed streets of medieval and early modern France, where the walls of stone and timber seemed to hold centuries of whispers, executioners moved as both feared agents and ritualized figures of justice. Their presence was both practical and symbolic, a reminder that the law wielded flesh and blood with measured precision to shield their identities and maintain a terrifying authority. Executioners often donned masked, grim visages that obscured the human beneath, transforming them into instruments of fear, morality, and spectacle. The masks were grotesque yet deliberate, heavy leather molded into distorted features, iron rivets glinting in torchlight, expressions frozen in perpetual cruelty or stoic impartiality. They concealed not only the executioner's face, but the fragile humanity that might waver in the presence of suffering. Clad in black or waxed cloth, the executioner carried instruments of death, axes, swords, or hammers, each one a ritual implement, each movement precise and ceremonial. Villagers, drawn by curiosity, fear, or obligation, gathered in silent anticipation, aware that the spectacle was as much about social order as it was about justice. The air was thick, with a scent of damp stone, smoke from nearby hearths, and the faint tang of blood, both anticipated and already shed. When a condemned figure was brought forth, every step resonated across the square. Drumbeats or the toll of a bell marked time, echoing against walls and cobblestones. Amplifying the tension, the executioner moved with the rhythm of ritual, each gesture deliberate, measured, and exact, as if every swing, every strike, every moment of suspense were choreographed by an unseen hand. The mask became a symbol, a talisman that transformed mortal fear into societal instruction, illustrating the consequences of transgression with chilling clarity. Some masks bore grotesque embellishments, exaggerated noses, horns, or twisted mouths that amplified terror, ensuring that the figure beneath was perceived as more than human. This was not merely for spectacle, it was a meditation on mortality, authority, and the psychology of awe. The executioner, hidden behind mask and costume, became the embodiment of justice itself, an almost supernatural arbiter whose presence was inseparable from fear and reverence. Even after the axe fell or the sword descended, after the crowd dispersed and silence reclaimed the square, the image lingered. The masks whispered across generations, symbols of the human need to reconcile justice with spectacle, mortality with ritual, and authority with fear. They remind us that ritualized violence has long been both a tool and a story, a way to impose order on chaos, to render mortality visible, and to transform the executioner from mere human into living symbol. When night falls over empty streets and torchlight fades, one can imagine the masks resting in shadow, yet still present, their hollow eyes observing, silent and eternal. They speak of the delicate boundary between life and death, of the power of ritual to shape society, and of the human imagination's ability to transform terror into meaning. In these masks, the living are reminded of mortality, the authority of law, and the enduring, haunting poetry of ritualized death. In the winding waterways of the Mekong Delta, where rivers snake through dense mangroves and the air is thick with humidity and the scent of earth, death travels in boats as surely as life does. For centuries, the communities along these waters have embraced a ritual in which the dead are not hidden but carried upon the currents, a solemn journey that binds the living to the departed and the river to memory. The corpse boats, simple yet reverent, glide silently over mirrored water, shrouds bellowing in the soft breeze as mourners follow in smaller crafts. their paddles slicing through reflection and shadow alike. The ritual begins at dawn or twilight. When the light is soft and the river holds both clarity and mystery, bodies are carefully washed, wrapped in linen or simple cloth, adorned with flowers, incense, and small offerings of food and trinkets for the journey ahead. Villagers gather along the banks, some kneeling, some standing, their faces etched with grief, devotion, and quiet reverence. Children cling to parents, eyes wide with awe and fear. As the deceased are carried to the water's edge, their passage watched by all who love, fear, or respect them. As the boats depart, the river seems to hold its breath. The gentle lapping of water against the hull is the only sound besides the faint rustle of leaves, and the whispered prayers of the living. Incense smoke curls into the humid air, mingling with the scent of the river, and the mourners move in silent cadence with the current, each paddle stroke both practical and symbolic. The corpse is carried toward the confluence of tributaries, where the river's flow will guide the soul onward, releasing it from the realm of the living and allowing ancestors, spirits, or divine forces to claim it. The journey is both intimate and communal. Mourners share memories and chants, sometimes songs that recall laughter, labor, or courage, keeping the presence of the departed alive even as the river bears them away. The living confront the fragility of life at every stroke, feeling both sorrow and continuity, understanding that mortality is not merely an end but a passage, a ritualized dialogue between the ephemeral and the eternal. Even after the boats vanish around a bend, leaving only ripples and the faint scent of incense on the breeze, the river seems to remember. It holds the echoes of voices, the weight of loss, and the reverent cadence of a community that transforms grief into ritual, mortality into meditation. The corpse boats of the Mekong whisper across time that life is fleeting, that the currents of memory and devotion carry the departed onward, and that in ritualized passage, humanity finds both solace and sacred continuity in the quiet of twilight. Where water mirrors sky and shadow, one can imagine the boats gliding endlessly, the river cradling body and spirit alike, and the living learning that death, like the flowing waters, is a journey not to be feared but honored, witnessed, and remembered. In every paddle stroke, every whispered prayer, the boundary between life and death softens, and the rhythm of mortality becomes both visible and eternal. On the windswept shores of what would become North Carolina in the late 16th century, settlers of the Roanoke colony carved out fragile lives from a land both abundant and alien. The air was thick with salt and brine, the forest alive with rustling leaves, hidden rivers, and the distant cries of creatures unknown to European ears. Yet by the time supply ships returned after years of delay, the colony had vanished, leaving behind only a single, enigmatic word carved into a post: Croatoan. The disappearance became one of the most haunting mysteries of the New World, a silent testament to human fragility, the unknown, and the enduring pull of speculation. The settlers, numbering over 100 men, women, and children, had arrived. With hope, ambition, and the weight of colonial dreams, they built crude homes, cleared fields, and attempted to navigate delicate relations with the native populations, whose customs, knowledge, and caution were as vital as the surrounding forests themselves. Letters sent back to England spoke of hardship and perseverance, of dwindling supplies and the relentless pressure of survival. Yet nothing could have prepared them, or those who waited in distant England, for the eventual silence that would descend over Roanoke. When Governor John White returned in 1590 after a delayed voyage, he found homes dismantled, fences broken, and the settlement deserted. Tools lay in place, food stores remained, and yet not a single colonist remained to greet him. The only clue was the carved word, Croatoan, suggesting a relocation, a surrender, or perhaps a warning. Search parties scoured the island and surrounding areas, but the dense forests, treacherous swamps, and hostile weather obscured all traces. Theories abounded: integration with local tribes, disease, starvation, or violent confrontation. Some whisper of supernatural forces, of curses, or of a landscape that demanded more than human ingenuity could provide. Generations have pondered the fate of the lost colony, imagining the children who vanished in the forests, the families swallowed by uncertainty, and the despair of those left behind. Archaeological hints occasionally surface: fragments of European pottery, traces of settlement, and even skeletal remains, but none confirm the ultimate fate. The mystery persists, a narrative suspended in time, hovering between history, legend, and the imagination. The Roanoke disappearance reminds us that human endeavor is fragile, that the unknown can claim lives without warning, And that history often leaves questions without answers. The empty houses, the carved word, and the whispering forest suggest both caution and awe that even when society and knowledge seem to dominate, the wilderness, fate, and unseen forces remain sovereign. In the quiet of twilight, when the wind stirs the trees along the coast, one can almost hear the echo of voices, lost, footsteps swallowed by sand and river, and the faint rhythm of lives that existed and vanished, leaving only a haunting word to speak across centuries, deep within the glittering halls of palaces, private collections, and the dimly lit rooms of jewelers. The Hope Diamond has long carried a story heavier than its 314 carats. Its blue facets cast the light and bend it into fire. Yet beneath the dazzling surface lurks a legend of misfortune, betrayal, and tragedy. From the royal courts of France to the drawing rooms of modern collectors, the gem has been said to bring ruin to those who possess it, a silent witness to human folly and the fragile interplay between desire and destiny. The diamond's journey begins in India, mined from the storied Golconda fields, where it was first known as the Tavernier Blue, named for the French gem merchant who transported it to Europe. There, in the hands of kings and queens, it became more than ornament. It became a symbol of power, wealth, and divine favor. Yet legend tells of a curse. Those who sought to own or covet it too greedily would face ruin, betrayal, or death. A minister executed, a king dethroned, a merchant ruined. All became part of the tapestry woven around the gem, each misfortune reinforcing its reputation, each tale another layer of fear surrounding the cold, beautiful stone. In France, the diamond adorned the crowns of monarchs, gleaming under candlelight as noble eyes watched and plotted. Revolution swept through, and the gem changed hands violently, smuggled, sold, and stolen. Each transfer seemed to deepen the whispers of curse and calamity. One owner died penniless, another in scandal. Lovers fell apart, heirs vanished, and yet the diamond remained untarnished, unbroken, as if mocking the vulnerability of those who sought its brilliance. When it finally reached the United States in the 20th century, the pattern continued. Financial ruin, mysterious deaths, and accidents trailed its path, like shadows cast by its blue fire. The allure of the Hope Diamond lies in its contradiction: exquisite beauty, untouchable brilliance, yet entwined with fear and misfortune. Those who behold it are captivated, mesmerized, caught between admiration and dread. Museums now display it behind glass, yet the story lingers in whispered tours, in tales told to visitors who imagine the gem's cold gaze observing their own ambitions. It is a meditation on human desire, vanity, and the fragile illusions of control. A stone, inanimate and eternal, that seems to wield power over flesh and fortune, reminding all who encounter it that beauty is never neutral and that even splendor may carry peril. When the lights dim in the museum halls and the blue fire of the diamond reflects quietly in its case, one can imagine the centuries of hands that reached for it, the whispered promises of wealth, the silent tragedies, and the unbroken, haunting persistence of the gem. The Hope Diamond whispers across time, a silent sentinel of history's intertwining of beauty, ambition, and human vulnerability. A story of fascination and caution that continues to mesmerize, terrify, and endure. In the fevered summers of medieval Europe, when the sun scorched cobblestones and the air shimmered with heat, entire towns were said to surrender to a compulsion beyond reason. Streets of Strasbourg, Aachen, and towns across the Rhine echoed, not with the quiet rhythms of daily life, but with the relentless beat of human feet as men, women, and children danced until exhaustion claimed them. This was the dancing mania, or choreomania, a phenomenon so bewildering that contemporaries could scarcely comprehend it. Yet it left a mark on history, a haunting reminder of the fragile boundary between joy, hysteria, and the mysterious forces that animate the human body. It began quietly, almost imperceptibly. One woman, caught in the grip of sudden ecstasy or inexplicable compulsion, stepped into the square and moved with a rhythm that was not her own. Others joined, drawn by contagion or sympathy, until dozens, then hundreds, swayed, twirled, and stamped across the stone streets. There were no musicians to dictate the pace, no bells to mark the rhythm, only the inexplicable insistence of bodies compelled to motion. Some danced with laughter, others with grim determination, yet all were caught in a trance neither voluntary nor entirely understood. Authorities, bewildered and desperate, attempted remedies that only deepened the spectacle. Clergy prayed, physicians prescribed, and yet the bodies continued their unrelenting motion. In Strasbourg in 1518, The townspeople even believed that more dancing might cure the affliction. Stages were erected, bands hired, and the plague of movement intensified. Feet blistered, joints ached, and some fell lifeless, yet still others danced on, as if the streets themselves demanded their devotion. Contemporary accounts describe exhaustion, madness, and death interwoven with a strange exhilaration, a collective surrender that defies easy explanation. The causes of choreomania remain debated. Scholars suggest ergot poisoning. The ingestion of rye fungus might have induced hallucinations and convulsions. Others point to mass hysteria, social stress, or religious fervor as the invisible hands that compelled the dancers. Yet the mystery persists. Why, at a particular moment, in particular towns, did the human body seize in unison, a living rhythm neither voluntary nor easily quelled? The unanswered questions hover like smoke above the empty squares, where the dancing once consumed entire communities. Even today, the image lingers, empty cobblestones, the faint echo of stamping feet, the shadow of a compulsion that seemed to spring from the very soul of the town. The dancing mania whispers of the tenuous control we possess over our bodies, of the unseen forces psychological, environmental, or divine that may seize us, and of the thin line separating celebration from catastrophe. It reminds us that human nature, however civilized, is vulnerable to inexplicable rhythms, and that sometimes joy and terror move together, step by relentless step, across the pages of history. High on the jagged cliffs of China's mountainous regions, where mist coils around limestone peaks and eagles wheel silently in the sky, the dead hang suspended between earth and sky for centuries. The Bo and other ethnic groups of southern China practice the ritual of hanging coffins, a haunting custom that defies ordinary understanding. These wooden coffins, small and weathered, are placed in narrow ledges, crevices, or protruding beams along cliffsides, their occupants elevated far above the reach of scavengers, water, and decay. To behold them is to confront a fragile intersection of mortality, devotion, and the human desire to preserve both memory and body. The journey to these coffins is perilous. Villagers carried their dead along narrow paths, ropes, and scaffolds constructed from bamboo and wood, balancing with the care of acrobats over yawning chasms. Each coffin required meticulous planning, ropes secured, the weight calculated, prayers uttered for safe passage, and offerings included to sustain the soul on its journey. The dead were clothed in fine garments or wrapped in cloth, their features remembered and honored, their spirits entrusted to the air, the wind, and the mountain itself. Communities gathered, observing in reverent silence, knowing that the act of placing the dead on cliffs was as much a meditation as a burial dialogue between the living, the deceased, and the forces that govern life and death. Over centuries, weather and time have eroded many coffins, yet some remain. They were gray and splintered, still clinging to the stone, still watching the valleys below. The placement serves as both protection and symbolism, the soul elevated closer to the heavens, the body shielded from decay, and the living reminded of the delicate balance between earthly existence and spiritual journey. Some believe the coffins bring blessings to the villages, ensuring prosperity and warding off misfortune. Others see them as solemn warnings, testaments to the effort and reverence demanded by death. Even today, the hanging coffins evoke awe and unease. The sight of a small, weathered box suspended on a cliff, with a silent occupant within, is a meditation on human devotion, ingenuity, and the intersection of fear and reverence. The ritual whispers of the impermanence of life, the power of memory, and the ways in which humans will bend earth, wood, and courage to honor those who have passed. As fog swirls around cliffs and the wind howls through narrow crevices, one can imagine the silent vigil of the dead, watching over the mountains and valleys. The hanging coffins endure as monuments to devotion, mortality, and the haunting beauty of a ritual that elevates the dead above the living, reminding us that memory, fear, and reverence can give form to the eternal in ways both terrifying and sublime. Beneath the bustling streets of Paris, where cafes spill their aroma of coffee and croissants in the sunlight and laughter, lies a shadowed world of silence, stone, and bones. The catacombs stretch for miles beneath the city, a labyrinth of tunnels and galleries lined with the remains of millions, arranged with eerie precision. Once quarries, then repositories for the dead, these subterranean halls are both macabre and sacred, a meditation on mortality, memory, and the human desire to contain, order, and confront death in forms both terrifying and beautiful. The air is cool, damp, and heavy with the faint scent of earth and limestone. Footsteps echo against walls that have held the weight of centuries. Each hollow tap a reminder of lives long vanished. Skulls and femurs are stacked meticulously along the corridors, sometimes forming arches, patterns, or symbolic designs that transform decay into ritualized art. Candles, when lit by explorers or caretakers, cast flickering shadows, turning each pile of bones into a silent audience, witnesses to both time and transgression. Some chambers are so narrow that a single person must pass carefully, almost reverently, aware of the stillness pressing against the skin, the weight of untold stories. Suspended in the stone, the catacombs were created in response to necessity. Overcrowded cemeteries above ground posed danger to the living, and the bones of the dead were moved with care into these quarries. Yet necessity gave rise to ritual and human imagination, transformed heaps of remains into solemn galleries that echoed devotion, fear, and the inevitability of death. Visitors speak of the hush that descends as one walks among the bones, a quiet reflection of mortality, and a confrontation with the fragile illusion of permanence that life offers. Every skull seems to gaze outward, every femur stacked with intent, reminding the living that the past endures in forms both shocking and contemplative. Legends grew around these subterranean halls, ghostly whispers, footsteps not one's own, and the sensation of unseen eyes watching have long accompanied tales of those who ventured afar. Yet the catacombs are also a monument to human resilience, a space where the living maintain a dialogue with the dead, arranging, remembering, and bearing witness to generations of mortality. They are both mausoleum and gallery, cemetery and cathedral, blending fear with reflection, horror with reverence. Even after one emerges into the sunlight, leaving behind narrow tunnels and walls of bones, the memory lingers, the echo of footsteps, the hollow gaze of skulls, and the profound reminder that beneath every city, beneath every street, lies the weight of lives past. The catacombs of Paris endure as a meditation on the transient nature of existence, the human impulse to order and ritualize mortality, and the silent poetry of death preserved in stone. In the shadows, the dead watch, and the living remember. Mortality is absolute, yet memory, ritual, and reverence can render it both tangible and eternal. In the highlands of Mexico, where mountains rise like silent sentinels and the air carries the scent of marigolds and copal incense, the living commune with the dead in a celebration both sacred and surreal. The Day of the Dead, or Dia de los Muertos, transforms cemeteries, plazas, and homes into vibrant stages where mortality is not feared but embraced, where memory and devotion dance together in colors, aromas, and ritual. Here, death is neither absence nor silence, it is presence, dialogue, and the delicate intertwining of life with the unseen. Altars are adorned with offerings, sugar skulls painted in brilliant hues, candles flickering in the evening breeze, flowers that burn gold in the sunlight, and personal objects of those departed. Families gather, arranging the altars with care, speaking to the spirits as though they might appear at any moment, recounting stories, laughter, and laments from years past. The scent of marigolds, believed to guide souls, drifts through streets and homes, mingling with incense smoke, tamales, and chocolate, creating a sensory tapestry that binds the material and the spiritual. Children, faces painted like tiny skeletons, follow the path strewn with petals, their footsteps a gentle echo of those who have walked before them. Processions wind through towns, the living moving with solemnity and joy alike. Music, both mournful and celebratory, accompanies dancers whose painted faces smile at the unseen, acknowledging the fragile boundary between worlds. Masks transform the human visage into the eternal, connecting each participant to ancestors whose lives shape the land and the community. The rituals are at once intimate and communal, each gesture a candle lit, a prayer murmured, a favorite dish placed on the altar, a bridge spanning life and death. Legends intertwine with practice. Spirits are said to return for one night, to walk among the living, to partake in offerings, to hear the memories told aloud. Those who follow the rituals believe in the liminality of this night, a sacred suspension where grief and celebration coalesce, and where mortality is rendered beautiful, tangible, and familiar. The altars, processions, and offerings transform fear into recognition, absence into presence, and mourning into meditation. Even after the candles burn low and the streets return to quiet, the memory of the departed lingers in scent, color, and shadow. The Day of the Dead endures as a poetic meditation on mortality, a reminder that life and death are threads of the same tapestry, and that memory, ritual, and devotion can render absence into presence. In the flickering glow of candlelight, one can almost see the silhouettes of ancestors moving silently, listening, watching, and embracing the living with the timeless continuity of love, reverence, and remembrance. High in the jagged peaks of the Alps, where snow clings to rock like a shroud and wind howls through ice-choked valleys, the dead often remain suspended between earth and sky, preserved by cold and time. Here, in these frozen heights, corpses have been discovered centuries after their passing, their flesh hardened, their expressions frozen in eternal moments of fear, exhaustion, or resignation. Climbers, shepherds, and explorers have stumbled upon these silent witnesses, remnants of avalanches, treacherous paths, or sudden storms, ghostly testimonies to human fragility in the face of nature's relentless grandeur. The Alps are a realm of beauty and terror intertwined. Sunlight glints off ice and snow, casting a brilliance that blinds as easily as it dazzles, while crevices yawn in the shadow, threatening to swallow the unwary. Travelers who dared these heights carried food, ropes, and hope, yet the mountains demand respect and caution, and many fell victim to their indifferent majesty. Corpses discovered in these places reveal intimate details, hands frozen in gestures of fear or prayer, eyes wide as though still searching the horizon, garments stiff with frost, and every breath long stilled. These frozen bodies are both evidence and myth, a haunting reminder of mortality carved into ice. In some cases, the bodies became inadvertent time capsules, preserving clothing, tools, and belongings in astonishing detail. Scholars and locals study these finds, piecing together lives interrupted, journeys halted, and the sudden violence of storms or slips that claim them. Yet the spectacle is never purely scientific. There's an awe and terror that accompanies the discovery, a visceral encounter with human vulnerability and the eternal power of the mountains. Frozen corpses speak without words, narrating tales of ambition, misfortune, courage, and the cruel impartiality of nature. Even centuries later, these silent witnesses endure, their icy repose a meditation on the tenuousness of life. As snow melts and glaciers shift, sometimes bones, sometimes faces emerge, startling and solemn, reminding the living that time and nature do not forget, and that human mortality is always fragile against the vast, indifferent landscape. The Alps hold their dead like sentinels, and in their silent, frozen gaze, one glimpses the limits of endurance, the inevitability of fate, and the haunting beauty of lives suspended between history and legend. When the wind whips through the peaks and snow crunches underfoot, it is easy to imagine the final moments of these travelers, a stumble, a cry, a prayer carried away by the storm. The frozen corpses of the Alps endure as both caution and reverence, a reminder that life is fragile, that nature commands respect, and that even in death, the human form can bear witness to courage, terror, and the eternal rhythm of mortality etched in ice. High on the windswept plateaus of Tibet, where mountains pierce the sky and clouds drift like wandering spirits, the dead are offered not to earth, nor to flame, but to the air itself. Sky burials, or jodder, transform mortality into ritual, turning flesh into sustenance for the vultures and returning the body to the vast cycle of life. Here, death is neither hidden nor feared. It is witnessed, honored, and integrated into the rhythm of the natural and spiritual world. A meditation on impermanence, devotion, and the delicate balance between humanity and the infinite. The ritual begins at dawn, when the light is pale and cold, brushing snow-capped peaks and high-altitude valleys with silver. Monks and family members prepare the body with care, washing, dressing, and sometimes reciting prayers to guide the spirit. The corpse is carried to an exposed cliff, where the wind is strong, the sky vast, and the silence almost absolute. There, the body is offered with solemnity to the circling birds, creatures regarded not merely as scavengers, but as sacred agents of transformation, conduits through which the departed are released from earthly bonds. Witnesses remain still, there, eyes fixed on the unfolding rite. Some chant, some pray silently, and some merely watch, understanding that in this act, grief is transformed into contemplation, sorrow into acceptance. The vultures descend with inevitability, tearing and carrying fragments into the sky, there, wings slicing the chill air, their presence both awe-inspiring and unsettling. The ritual, harsh to the uninitiated, embodies a profound philosophy. The body is temporary, the spirit eternal, and the cycle of giving and returning is sacred. Sky burials are also a reflection of the harsh landscape. in high-altitude Tibet. Where soil is frozen and trees scarce, traditional burial or cremation is often impossible. Necessity and spirituality intertwine, and the ritual endures as a testament to human ingenuity, reverence, and humility in the face of mortality. It is both practical and transcendent, a choreography of grief and devotion that transforms death into a visible, living meditation on impermanence, even after the ritual ends. The wind carries echoes of chants, the shadow of wings, and the lingering presence of both the dead and the living. The cliffs seem to remember every body offered, every prayer whispered, and every soul lifted skyward. The ritual of sky burial endures as a haunting testament to the ways humans confront death with courage, devotion, and surrender. In the stillness of the Tibetan heights, one can imagine the silent ascent of spirits, the vast sweep of sky, and the delicate truth that life and death are bound together in a cycle both terrifying and sublime, a cycle in which the body returns to nature, the spirit to eternity, and memory to the living who witness with reverence. The forests and plains of Tasmania, long before European eyes fell upon the island, were home to peoples whose lives were intertwined with wind, water, and fire. The Aboriginal tribes moved with the rhythms of the land, tracking seasons, reading the currents of rivers, and honoring the spirits that lingered in rock, tree, and sky. Yet by the 19th century, these communities had begun to vanish, leaving only traces of their presence: rock carvings, stone tools, and the faint echoes of songs carried by the wind. The disappearance of Tasmania's tribes is a haunting story, one of colonization, disease, and cultural erasure, a meditation on fragility, resilience, and the silent persistence of memory. When Europeans first arrived, they encountered a people whose knowledge of the land was profound, whose traditions and rituals spoke of connection, storytelling, and survival. Tribes hunted with skill, gathered with care, and moved across the rugged terrain in patterns dictated by centuries of observation and instinct. Yet the newcomers brought more than curiosity. They brought displacement, violence, and illness, forces that the indigenous communities could neither foresee nor withstand. Disease spread with quiet inevitability, sifting through villages, leaving empty shelters and abandoned hearths, the silence of mortality supplanting the rhythm of daily life. Those who survived often faced capture, forced relocation, and the dismantling of social and spiritual structures. Families were separated, ceremonies forbidden, languages suppressed. The vanishing was both physical and cultural, a slow, inexorable erasure that left landscapes familiar yet hollow, carrying the weight of absence in every valley, river, and forest glade. Yet the memory of these people endures, encoded in the land itself, in oral histories preserved by descendants, and in the faint traces of tools, carvings, and footprints that endure like whispers in stone and soil. Even today, one can walk the plains and forests of Tasmania and feel the lingering presence of those who vanished. The wind through the eucalyptus carries echoes of songs. The curves of river banks reflect centuries of careful passage, and the quiet of empty valleys speaks of resilience and loss intertwined. The story of the vanishing tribes is a meditation on mortality, cultural fragility, and the profound ways human existence can be altered or erased by forces beyond control. It is a haunting reflection on absence and memory, that a people, though nearly erased from the world, leave traces that speak across centuries, reminding the living of what was lost, of what endures, and of the delicate, often tragic, interplay between humanity, history, and the relentless currents of time. In the stillness of Tasmanian forests, the vanished lives whisper, urging remembrance, reverence, and reflection on the impermanence not only of life, but of entire cultures caught in the shadow of inevitability.